The first feast that Ken read about this morning, the feast featuring the dancing daughter Salome and the beheading of John the Baptizer, it's all a flashback. So, being a flashback, the authors of Mark's Gospel could have put it anywhere in the narrative, but they didn't. They put it next to the Feast of the 5,000. They put these two feasts together. The first feast is by the empire for the empire, and the second feast is by God for God's people. Now, what's more, the beheading of John the Baptizer is in Mark's Gospel, smack dab between the disciples being sent out 2 by 2, performing miracles, healing and casting out demons, and the disciples and Jesus feeding the 5,000. The beheading of John the Baptizer could have been put anywhere, but it wasn't. It was put here, and that should tell us something. Following on the heels of the disciples' first mission, it reminds us that being a disciple is dangerous work. People will have your head for doing the work of God. It's a risk being a disciple. But see then, before we're scared off completely by John losing his head, another feast follows, and we're reminded all over again that the risks are great, but God is greater. God is in charge. Providence abounds. Jesus goes, we just need to follow. The need is great, but God is greater. If we're but willing to participate, God will feed the need. And if we're not willing to participate, well, what was that Jesus was saying last week about shaking the dust off our feet? God will lead whoever will follow. So if we're not willing to follow, someone else will be. Might as well get on with it. There's work to be done. There's a feast afoot. And that's what we're talking about this morning. So as we prepare for the word preached, would you join with me, your hearts and minds, in prayer? Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be found acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The first feast should make our skin crawl. This story drips with greed and with lust, and with envy and with vengefulness. It's a study in the misuse of power, both the abuse of and the underuse of power. Herod's thrown a feast, a birthday bash for himself, and he's invited the Good Old Boys Club to come and party with him. Like Ken imagined for us, there's food and there's wine and there's a dancing girl who happens to be his stepdaughter Salome. And Salome is young, or at least she's young in spirit. How do we know that she's young in some way? Because she's not even old enough to know what to ask for when Herod tells her that as a reward for pleasing his guests, she can have whatever she wants. She's not even old enough to know what she wants. Mama, what should I ask for? Salome says. Now, Salome's mama is a smart woman. She has a score to settle with John the Baptist because John is causing all kinds of trouble for her marriage, which is already in trouble. This is her chance. And so, taking advantage of her daughter's naivete and taking advantage of her husband's lack of backbone, she tells Salome to ask for John's head. Salome gleefully acquiesces. Herod shamefully acquiesces as well. See, Herod likes John. He likes to listen to him talk. Herod knows that there's something there. But he'll betray his relationship with John right now so as to not lose face in front of the boys. Off with his head. Sorry, buddy, that's the way it goes. The first feast should make our skin crawl. You better believe it should. It's a character study in the worst that human beings can be. The absolute worst. And then, Mark's gospel shows us the best that human beings can be. The disciples, just back from their first foray into kingdom building, are off with Jesus for a little R&R. The disciples' tour of duty has catapulted Jesus' popularity beyond his mere rock star status. It is out of the stratosphere. There's a huge crowd following Jesus now. 5,000 people surround Jesus and the 12. Well, 5,000 men. We can only imagine how many women and children there are too. And after a while, the disciples notice that there's a need. People are hungry. Jesus listens and responds very simply, "Go, see what you have. Bring it back and share it." That's the whole equation for meeting people's need in the world, according to Jesus. Go, see what you have, bring it back, share it. That's it. That's the solution for meeting needs. Big needs, even. 5,000 hungry people-sized needs. Go, see what you have, bring it back, share it. Say it with me. Go, see what you have, bring it back, share it. Go, see what you have, bring it back, share it. See, God doesn't ask for an arm and a leg, or a head, as the case may be in the previous story. No, God does not ask for our heads on platters. God simply asks that we look at what we have and we share it. Now you'll notice a few things here, church. Jesus does not say, now let's form a committee and then create a survey and let's do a study of what people really need, actually need. And then let's see, we'll need to create a budget line item after next month's meeting. Or does that have to wait until the annual meeting? I don't know. Let's check the bylaws and I'll report back next month, blah, blah, blah. You know how that goes, right? Nope, Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus also doesn't say, now, you know, we just asked the disciples to give of themselves. They just gave miracles and healings. It's too soon to ask them to give again. We don't want to make the disciples mad. We don't want them to think we're always asking for something. No, no, no. Tell the hungry people to go away until we can schedule their need at a better time for us. Nope, Jesus doesn't say that either. Now, I tease us because I am one of us. I tease us because I care, and I tease us because I'm just as guilty of making those excuses as any of us is. If we only had the teeniest, tiniest bit of faith in Jesus to lead us. And if we only had the teeniest, tiniest ounce of faith in each other. If we only trusted each other the way Jesus trusts us. He trusts us to go and see what we have and bring it back and share it. He trusts us to go and take an honest stock of our time and talents and money and resources. He trusts us then to give what we can. That's why he never declines issuing the invitation to help. He trusts his disciples to do what they can do when they can do it. And if the disciples can't, then he trusts us to know that there's no judgment on his part. Oh, if we could only trust each other in the same way. Again, God doesn't ask for an arm and a leg, or a head, as the case may be. No, God simply asks that we look at what we have and that we share it. Go, see what you have, bring it back, share it. So there's a story about a pastor of a small church in a small town. And that pastor starts asking his congregation if they would help meet the needs of hungry folks in their community. That need is growing, and so he asks them if they would provide a meal once a week for whomever needs it. Well, they talk about it, and they balk about it. For months on end, they do this. How could we ever afford such a thing? They ask. Do you know how much food that would take? We're a small church. We don't have those kind of resources. We could never do that. After months and months and months of conversation, the pastor finally says, okay, all right, let's stop talking about it. If you'll do this one thing for me, and if you still don't think we have enough, then we won't do a weekly meal. The church agrees. And so the pastor says, go home. See what you have in your pantries and your freezer. Count how many cans of green beans, how many bags of onions and pounds of potatoes. Look in your freezer. How many turkeys and hams are buried under the casseroles? Count the casseroles too. People went home and they counted. And they realized they had so much food. Together, they had hundreds of cans of green beans and mounds of potatoes and onions. They had enough hams and turkeys to feed that town for eternity, and casseroles to follow. We ought not believe in the myth of scarcity because it's just not true. We ought not believe in the myth of scarcity. It's just not true. Now we have a different need to feed here at Community UCC. We made a commitment years ago to renovate our lower level and to do some other renovations. The renovations are done now, and we have to complete those payments. And even though I wasn't your pastor at that time, by joining the church, it's my commitment too. And so if you've joined the church since that decision was made, by joining, it's your commitment too. Well, we've hit a lull in our capital campaign to raise money to pay that. This morning I found out that the figure, it's a little different from what's on the wall. As of this morning, we have 22 pledges equaling $92,356. It's time that we follow Jesus' lead. Go, see what you have, bring it back, share it. If we all did that, the need would be met. I believe that we would meet the goal of our capital campaign. In fact, I believe if we all did that, we would exceed it. Now, Pastor, you might say, we're not going home looking for cans of green beans. This is money. And this need, Pastor, well, we're not trying to feed hungry people. We're paying for our own building. Does that count? Does that amount to the work of the disciples? Is this mortgage paying really ministry? I would say yes. And here's why. Our building matters. Now, if we sat out on Mattis or Philo roads, I wouldn't be so convinced of this point. But here we sit at the corner of 6th and Daniel Street, and for 9 whole months out of every year, thousands of people from all over the world walk by this building every day, and they are hungry. Our building and what it stands for and what happens out of the ministry that you do in this place feeds their need. They are hungry for love, and our building tells every person who walks by that God loves them unconditionally, no matter what. They are hungry for peace in this violent world, and our building tells every person who walks by that peace is possible and that love will win in the end. They are hungry for acceptance, and our building tells every person who walks by that our differences ought not divide us, but unite us. Our building tells every person who walks by a story that isn't told to them by the other buildings in these few blocks. Like when they walk past the bars, where they are judged by how they look. Or like the classroom buildings, where they are judged by what they produce. Or other churches on campus, some of whom judge them for who they love, human or divine. Our building tells a different story. Our building feeds their needs with what matters. Our building matters in this place. So can you imagine what would happen if we exceeded our goal? Can you imagine, come stewardship time, for that matter, what would happen if we had money to spare in the budget? What other needs could we feed in Champaign-Urbana? What other needs could we feed in Chicago? What other needs could we feed in Appalachia? What other needs could we feed in the United Church of Christ? What other needs could we feed in the world? What would happen if come stewardship time we each followed Jesus' advice to go, see what you have, bring it back, and share it? What happened if we all came back with a surplus, if there were baskets of extra to be passed around? What would happen if, like in the gospel story, we had extra bread and extra fish? What would happen? What would happen if we gave so much that we could turn our own church budget into a tithe, if we dedicated 10% of our operating budget to mission and outreach instead of the tiny percentage that it is now? What could we do if we trusted God and if we trusted each other enough to say, go, see what you have, bring it back, and share it? Go, see what you have, bring it back, and share it. Go. See what you have. Bring back what you have and share.